Alright guys, welcome back to the channel, welcome back to another video. We have got the Year 7 LRSSJ4s versus the Ultimate Red Zone Wicked Bloodline Edition Meta Cooler Court. Now, if you have seen the LR Birdcoo video, this is the exact same footage from that. The reason why I'm using this is because when it's come to using Superclass teams against this guy, my runs either haven't been going that well, or because all the better units are at 55%, which it's still doable, it's still beatable, clearly. But because the units are at 55%, it's a lot more difficult to not just beat it, but more importantly for content-wise, it's a lot more difficult to really have a good showing of a unit that's worth making content around and worth turning into a video. So during the LR Birdcoo video, not only did Birdcoo pop off, but so did both the Year 7 LRs. So I will be using this one more time around the gods, but I'll do that in a few days so it's not kind of back to back of kind of the same video, if you will. So I do apologize for that, but it kind of makes sense, and it's that usual phrase of work smarter, not harder. So that's exactly what I'm doing now. Don't forget to drop a like, subscribe if you're new though, and let me know down in the comments, how have you been finding doing runs against Cooler Core? He's a bit of a tough bastard, he really is. But the SSJ4s are on rotation right now, and that brings me into my first point of why they are very valuable here. Of course, the first phase against the Cooler Army, phase 1. The main goal of this phase, of course, isn't to beat the Cooler Army, it is to survive. For 3 turns, for 9 charges, all you have to do is survive, and the main goal is to conserve as much health and as many items going into the Cooler Core phase as much as possible. Preferably, of course, you want to be able to conserve as much health and save both items. But if you really need to, you can use one Whis here and still be able to beat Cooler Core as we do in this run. But preferably you do want both, otherwise you do need to kind of rely on a little bit more RNG going into the second phase than of course if you had both Whis instead of one. So that is the goal. One of the major advantages to both the LRSSJ4 specifically is they have type advantage here. So immediately, even though they did take 190k on a super attack, they're going to tank a lot better than a lot of units that you're going to bring with you. Aside from the gods, specifically the friend ones, considering they did have dupes in, so they do kind of have a little bit of an edge. But they're going to tank relatively well, because again, I have these at 55%, and a lot of you may have them at 55% as well, if you didn't get lucky enough to pull dupes, or did what I did and stop at pulling one copy and just save your stones. But that is a major advantage, especially at tanking a lot less when you want to conserve as much HP as possible. The type advantage definitely does help. And another thing, which you can only utilize for 1 turn, but it definitely does help considering you're only in here for 3 turns anyway, is of course the guard that both Year 7 units have on turn 1. Now of course the guard is useful anyway, because just naturally, as soon as you start and have the guard turn 1, they wouldn't have built up any of their attack and defense yet. They haven't even started supering. Specifically if you're going to put them in turn 1 and you're taking attacks prior to them supering. Of course, it's a lot more ideal, and again, specifically in this scenario, considering I have type advantage against Cooler Army, for them to be able to get off a super attack, the built-in additional if you get enough key, and if you're lucky enough with 55% to get the free dupe additional off, or if you have dupes in as well to get an additional off, they're obviously going to tank amazingly well, coupled with the guard, the type advantage, and all the super attacks they would have got off. But naturally, they will tank relatively well compared to other units, aside from ones that also have guard or damage reduction like GOKU, Birdcoo, and the Year 7 gods as well, to an extent. On turn 1, prior to them getting any super attacks off, they'll have type advantage and guard, so they can tank relatively well on basics. As we saw on turn 1, they tanked like 5k, which isn't naturally ideal, but considering how much damage you can take on that phase, and specifically against Cooler Core as we're doing now, it's definitely a lot better in the grand scheme of things, and 190k on a super attack is actually not bad considering what I've seen other units take against the Cooler Army. So that definitely does help. The guard turn 1 and specifically the type advantage. But now moving on to Cooler Core, now that we've managed to survive. Of course this turn, because we were kind of focusing on Birdcoo in this video, I was going for the revive. But lucky enough for us, we managed to get a super attack off before we did die and trigger Birdcoo's revive. But one thing that is definitely helpful here, and kind of helpful in all red zone stages of course, once we fuse into GOGETA, and once we have the active skill conditions ticked off, we can use their active skill. And of course, since they have the built-in additionals, you could again get lucky enough with 5 additionals, specifically in the SSJ4s. You could have dupes, but just so it's quite easy to build up your attack and defense, you have a massive ace in a hole. You have a massive trick up your sleeve when it comes to their active skill, specifically against Cooler Core, because you can do a whole bunch of damage. You could also potentially crit on said active as well, especially if you have dupes. And then another thing that's such a huge advantage in Red Zone in general as well is the fact that they disable an enemy action on super attack. Now, of course, both year 7s can do this, but just naturally against Cooler Core, because he does so much damage on basics and obviously so much damage on supers anyway, you're talking like 1.6 mil. Having that tool in your arsenal is so useful. Now, in my experience in Red Zone, you know, with it being out for a few months, you know, playing in both, or not both now, all 3 versions, Wicked Bloodline, GT, and Movie Edition, a lot of the time you end up getting super attacks in slot 1. Now, whether that's slot 1 before you super attack or slot 1 after you super attack is neither here nor there, but a lot of the time it ends up being slot 1. So typically when it comes to, you know, triggering off the disable enemy action when you hit their 18 key, a lot of the time you're kind of getting rid of a basic, which can be useful depending on who you're facing and if you get an additional off, which of course you won't find out until after you do the 18 key. So it could actually help the year 7 LRs anyway. It can still make an impact. It can still help them and help you, you know, take a little less damage and conserve some HP, even if it is only 1 less attack, or potentially it could be 1 attack in slot 2, which is typically where they'll be, and you end up avoiding, you know, the top amount of damage they'll end up taking because it's only 1 attack. But on the off chance that you end up, you know, you don't know this until, you know, the time ends up being done, and even then, you might not even be super attacked, but on the off chance you get lucky enough, the 18 key disabling the enemy action could potentially, not likely, but could potentially be a super attack, and you could be lucky enough to end up disabling the enemy super attack. Which of course you'll never know this because you don't know if he was going to super attack you regardless that turn, but you know, it is always a possibility. And even if he doesn't super attack you, or even if you end up lucky enough, even though you won't know, but getting lucky enough to disable the enemy super attack, specifically against Cooler Core. Now I don't do it here, or I don't know if I do it here, but specifically against Cooler Core, that's a 1.6 million super attack you could potentially end up avoiding because the year 7s end up disabling that attack. So that's another thing that's a huge help. Not just here, it definitely really does help here considering how much damage you can take, but just naturally in Red Zone. And another thing that you can do now, because they've been doing this in a lot more recent Red Zone stages, is you can dodge and counter Cooler Core. You know, with Red Zone, Broly, and Omega Shenron being their respective like hardest stages in their versions, you couldn't dodge and counter them. And even though I don't do it here, even though it's not that likely, you don't have the biggest chance to do so, if it did happen, we would have the chance to be able to counter Cooler Core. Same with the gods being able to dodge, but we could counter the Cooler Core in this event. Without having any rainbow key spheres attached to it. By the way, big up Jeets for countering that, otherwise we'd have been dead. There's no rainbow key spheres attached to it, of course, that's the damage reduction, which also helps, especially if you do get enough super attacks off, and of course get the 18 key off to massively raise your attack and defense by 100%. Doesn't do too much, but it definitely helps, it pads you out a little bit more. But you can counter Red Zone bosses nowadays, specifically, and that's, again, a 1.6 million super attack that you could potentially counter with GOGETA, which means you avoid a whole bunch of damage. And then not only that, if you supered prior to that, specifically with an 18 key and got lucky enough to get the additional, and then lucky enough to get the second additional, regardless if you have dupes or not, that's a whole lot of damage GOGETA could potentially do on a counter attack. And that leads me into my final point of, you can do a lot of damage with the year 7 LRs, which is just as important as defense in Red Zone. You need to survive, yes, but you also need to do the big damage, which not many units in the game aside from Cooler and even the year 7s can do. So you actually need to beat the boss. You need to beat the Red Zone bosses. And even though we didn't get an 18 key off the turn prior to this, GOGETA popped off with 312 keys and done over 2 million damage per super attack, which is over 6 million damage in total. So yeah, while they did really well, they also do a lot of damage, which helps you end up beating the Cooler Core, which is just as important. But that's the run. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Don't forget to drop a like, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next video, guys. And peace.